Hello, and welcome back to Podfinder. This is Day 9 of the 12 Days of Sinmas. And, if you don't know what that means, pause this video and check out the playlist I've linked in the description. The Prelude video explains everything. Today, I'm digging into the Sin of Sloth and its associated magical School of Conjuration. I'll also be covering the Runelords of Sloth, and the nation of Haruka, over which they ruled. Before that, though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. And, before I forget, check out the timeline I put together of Thassilon's history. If you're a visual person, it will really help you get a hold of the history of Xin and the Runelords who would take over his empire. Link in the description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's dig in. The Sin of Sloth was a corruption of the virtue of zeal, and was associated with the magical School of Conjuration. Upon casting a conjuration spell, practitioners of rune magic would experience a sense of restfulness. Those practicing the virtue of zeal would accept this feeling as a reminder that the world's problems could never be solved by one person, then use that information to direct their actions toward those things in their lives which they could control and change. By contrast, those indulging in the Sin of Sloth would interpret these feelings as a sign that no amount of effort on their part would ever be enough to solve their problems, and as such would pursue the easiest and laziest solutions to any issue. This resulted in a series of Runelords who had little interest in the world around them or in the accomplishment of great works. That the nation of Haruka, realm of Sloth, was the smallest of the 7 fiefdoms within Thassilon is little wonder. As a point of meta-discussion, the virtue associated with the Sin of Sloth is most often called out as zeal, but some publications instead name the virtue of rest. In this interpretation, the virtuous behavior is working hard, then recognizing the importance of rest for the overall health of oneself and one's fellows. I'm not sure if the change from rest to zeal is a retcon, or is intended to represent disagreement between the scholars of Golarion, though I personally suspect it is the former. The School of Conjuration. The School of Conjuration is the magic of matter and space, 2 of the fundamental building blocks of the material plane. Due to the broad nature of these building blocks and the myriad ways they can interact, spells from this school are incredibly versatile and can accomplish many tasks. Spells of this school focus on the creation and maintenance of matter for a short time, or the bending of space to allow for the transportation of matter and energy. Much like the School of Necromancy discussed previously, conjuration spells can be broadly divided into 3 categories: creation, teleportation, and summoning. The creation subschool does what it says on the tin, allowing spellcasters to create matter from nothing and shape it to their will. These spells draw on matter at a metaphysical level, pulling the very concept of matter from the outermost reaches of the universe, and temporarily, or sometimes permanently, giving it shape in the material plane. The nature of this shape, the various physical properties of the material created, and its relative location to the caster are all defined by the spell being cast, as well as the casting process of each individual spell. The versatility of this subschool is easily demonstrated by spells like Wall of Stone and Wall of Water. The nature of the creations is entirely different, from their duration to the type of matter they create, but both are creation spells. On the other end of the conjuration spectrum are the teleportation spells, which bend space to create connections between 2 distinct places and allow for instantaneous travel between them. This subschool is a bit less versatile in its effects, but no less useful, as the distance traveled, the number of targets, and the limitations or precision of the target location can all be controlled by a master teleporter. Spells of this subschool include the famous teleport spell, but also things like blink, plane shift, or unexpected transposition. Spells of this nature can provide casters with a handy escape from their enemies, or with impressive utility for their allies. Right in between these subschools is summoning, a division of spells which was, until very recently, the subject of much debate on Golarion. For a long time, summoning spells were thought to draw living creatures from somewhere in the great beyond, then release them in the vicinity of the caster and compel them to serve at the caster's command. This would have put them much closer in function to teleportation spells, drawing living beings from one place to another. However, it has recently been discovered on Golarion that summoning spells are actually much closer in function to creation spells. They gather the raw essence of matter from the universe, then form it into a living vessel, instilling that creature with life energy and even a small amount of raw soul. This might even imply a small connection between the summoning subschool of creation and the soul magic subschool of necromancy, though that's pure conjecture on my part. It's worth noting, however, that summoners are not creating or transporting actual living beings when they summon creatures to fight on their behalf. These figures are merely simulacra, matter imbued with enough life and soul to function for a brief time, but not nearly enough to be truly sentient or sapient. And that's summoners, the type of wizard, not summoners, the class. Eidolons work a little bit differently. The summoning subschool has historically earned it a bit of a poor reputation among academics on Golarion. Summoners, again, the wizards, not necessarily the class, have a tendency to develop a cold and calculating worldview, especially where the lives of others are involved. Their reliance on summoned beings, which often die in their service, can imbue them with an irreverence for the sanctity of life, and so they might start to treat allies or even friends with an air of detachment. In the worst cases, with the Runelords of Sloth, for example, this even manifested as seeing all living beings as little more than expendable and ultimately replaceable tools. Within the confines of rune magic, conjurers were forbidden from engaging with spells of the evocation or illusion schools. With these as their opposition schools, conjurers were limited in the amount of direct damage they could deal to their opponents on the battlefield. This forced them to rely even more heavily on allies in a fight, either those they summoned or those they could teleport in from far away. Their lack of illusion spells also forced them to generally embrace more straightforward combat tactics, battlefield control with walls or hazards, and careful positioning of allies with summons and teleportation. Conjurers were also difficult to pin down in melee, as their teleportation spells and summoned minions allowed them to maintain a substantial distance between them and their foes. The Rune of Sloth was commonly interpreted as a lounging figure, representative of the followers of Sloth who often reclined in a languid position while they studied their art. The gentle curve of the rune brings to mind a relaxed pose, and a general air of inaction. To my knowledge, no other interpretations exist. The Runelords of Sloth. The first Runelord of Sloth was Xirie, a name which should be familiar to any viewers who have been watching or listening to these videos in release order. Xirie was one of the 7 apprentices who were given the title of Runelord by Xin himself. She was likely an Aslanti noblewoman, but beyond that, very little of her personality or history is known, prior to her ascension to power. She likely contributed extensively to the plan to assassinate Xin, as her teleportation magic was likely used to place the rune giant assassin Shasthak into the Crystal Palace, after Xin's defenses were lowered. As the first Runelord of Sloth, or Zeal at the time, Xirie was presented with the Thassilonian of Conjuration, the Dragon-Tooth Spear. The Dragon-Tooth Spear was widely regarded as the weakest of the Thassilonian, though whether this was due to some fault on the part of Xin, or a reflection of the laziness of the weapon's eventual rulers, is very much a matter of debate. The weapon appears to have been forged using the tooth of an actual dragon, though the specifics of which dragon remain a mystery. The spear was, like all weapons of rule, infused with an innate intelligence. It was a devout worshipper of Lysala, and expected its wielder to maintain the same faith, or at least a degree of respect for the goddess. The spear also strongly encouraged its wielder to relax and take things easy, and was well known to pamper and spoil its masters into a lifestyle of indolence, assuming they didn't come by such a lifestyle naturally. When a wielder of the spear became too active or aggressive, the weapon would criticize and chide them for being too hasty or reckless. We know very little about the Dragontooth spear mechanically, except that it definitely had the dancing property, or at least an ability which functioned similarly, as it was known to fight alone on behalf of its wielder. Upon her appointment to the position of Runelord, Xirie took up the management of Haruka, a nation on the eastern edge of Thassilon. Haruka was, by a significant margin, the smallest of the 7 Thassilonian member kingdoms. It was bordered by Eurythnia to the south and Shalast to the west, with the Mindspin Mountains boxing it in from the east. While Haruka was relatively poor in natural resources, it was nonetheless a wealthy land. Under the Runelords of Sloth, Haruka became the central hub for the slave trade in Thassilon. The slavers of Haruka were known throughout the empire and beyond for the quality of their living wares, from effective but ultimately replaceable house slaves to exotic entertainers and concubines from the farthest reaches of Galarian and beyond. Even extraplanar servants weren't out of reach where conjurers of Haruka were concerned. Much of the population was involved, either directly or indirectly, in the slave trade, and many conjurers used their mastery of teleportation networks to travel vast distances to buy and sell their miserable goods. In addition to the humans of Haruka, the domain played host to numerous tribes of both boggards and hill giants, both of which took place in the many slave rebellions throughout the nation's history. Additionally, many tribes of Kolo, once called Gnolls, dwelled within Haruka and often filled the ranks of the nation's armies. Interestingly, the presence of Kolo within the slavery-loving Haruka might contribute to the cultural stereotype of Kolo as slavers in Avestan. Notably, the population of Kolo in Avestan decreased drastically in the years after Earthfall, to the point where they are incredibly rare in Varisia in the Age of Lost Omens. In addition to being the center of the Thassilonian slave trade, Haruka carved out a place for itself as the religious heart of Thassilon. Haruka played host to the high priests of the Church of Lissala, which was the most prominent faith among the Thassilonian nobility throughout the empire's history. The nation also hosted many of the higher-ups in the Church of the Peacock Spirit, which I will cover in more detail in my video discussing the Sin of Pride. These two faiths, that of Lissala and the Peacock Spirit, constantly vied for dominance in Haruka, and competition and even violence between their priests was common. Interestingly, Xirie's position within this religious hierarchy isn't entirely clear. While it is commonly accepted that many of the Runelords of Sloth were also high priests of Lissala, the only one for whom I could find direct confirmation of this was Krune. I would not be at all surprised if his predecessors were the heads of either of the two major faiths in Haruka, but I would also not be surprised if they were simply outsiders who played the faiths against one another to maintain power. Xirie appears to have been one of these outsiders, as it is known that she was a devout follower of Kolafir, the demon lord of dragons. The faith of Kolafir was not one of the major faiths in Haruka, to my knowledge, so it's entirely possible, and even likely, that Xirie was the leader of the cult of Kolafir in Haruka. It's known that Kolafir took special interest in her, and she was considered his mightiest mortal servant on Galarian. For her capital, Xirie chose a location along the cliffs of the Storval Plateau, which she named Zin Haruka. The city was a wonder to behold. While less grand than many of the other capitals, it had a few wonders all its own. A complex portal network allowed for easy transportation throughout the city, and innumerable conjured unseen servants constantly worked to keep the city pristinely clean. Hundreds, if not thousands, of extraplanar beings could be seen on the streets of the city every day. The only visual I could find on Zin Haruka was from the return of the Runelord's map folio, but this provides a tantalizing glimpse into what the city might have been. The city appears to have been carved into the very cliffs of the Storval Plateau, built to look out over the Varisian plains below. The verticality of the city might have been the primary reason for this portal network. In addition to the city itself, the face of the Runelord might have also been carved into the cliffside as well. Unfortunately, for reasons I will get into near the end of this series, this is all the information available on Xin Haruka, and I seriously doubt we will get much more. It seems like a fascinating city, and I would love to explore it more in a future book. Though we know fairly little about the specifics of her rule, Xirie appears to have been quite busy in her 330 years on the throne, especially for a Runelord of Sloth. I should note, before I describe the following major events, that the exact dates for most of these are unclear, but I'll cover them here in the order which I believe makes the most narrative sense for this video. As the first Runelord of Sloth, Xirie began a grand tradition which each of her successors would continue without fail. With the enormous number of slaves within her nation, Xirie had access to an immense pool of labor, and she set this workforce to the task of constructing immense monuments of both practical and pragmatic design. The most well-known of these, and the one which would continue to evolve throughout Haruka's history, would eventually become known as Desgard's 1,000 Columns. This site was located in a deep ravine on the Storval Plateau, which was peppered with naturally occurring crystals, brimming with arcane power. Xirie found she could harness the innate magic of these crystals to augment and enhance her conjuration abilities. She discovered that she could summon more powerful minions when in the presence of these crystals, and could maintain the summons more easily. Sensing an opportunity, she set to work. Xirie ordered the construction of an immense stone tower within the canyon, a miniature fortress. Once it was complete, she imbued it with powerful binding magic, drawing on the power of the nearby crystals. Then she cast her most powerful summoning spells, drawing forth legions of mighty servants from across the great beyond. She trapped these servants within the tower, preserving them in stasis so she might call upon them to augment her armies in times of need. Of course, Xirie didn't just stop at one tower. As the other Runelords of Thassilon grew in power, Xirie felt compelled to strengthen her armies and to secure her position. Over her reign, she produced dozens, perhaps even hundreds, more towers within the ravine. Within each, she squirreled away host after host of powerful warriors from around the multiverse. And thus, the 1,000 Columns of Desgard were founded. Xirie, and each of her successors, made a habit of regularly constructing new towers, or columns, throughout the entirety of the Thassilonian period. While the inhabitants of each tower served to strengthen Haruka's armies, the later Runelords also made further modifications to the structures within the ravine. As old Runelords of Sloth were overthrown, or simply died of old age, the secrets of the legions they had stored away died with them. Critically, this often included the secrets of how to control these legions, meaning that later Runelords, like Krune, had no direct method of controlling the forces summoned by their predecessors. For this reason, each later Runelord was forced to place increasingly powerful wards on the towers constructed by their predecessors, for fear of what might happen should the warriors or monsters within one of them ever escape. Visually, the 1,000 Columns of Desgard is a rich locale. The ravine itself is deep, likely hundreds of feet in places. Pillars and outcroppings of naturally occurring crystal sprout from the walls and floor of the canyon, and these flicker with internal reserves of arcane power. While visually similar in a broad sense, each of the hundreds of remaining towers within the canyon is unique, having been constructed by different groups of laborers over a 1,000-year period. Much like the crystals, the towers are charged with an internal battery of stored conjuration magic. This stored magic interacts strangely with the casting of conjuration spells within the canyon. Such spells have a high chance of misfiring, or producing unintended side effects. As an example, summoning spells have a small chance of accidentally drawing one of the trapped soldiers within the towers, rather than the intended summoned creature, potentially putting low-level conjurers in a very dangerous position if they accidentally call something too powerful for them to control. Interestingly, it's unclear if the canyon ever actually contained 1,000 or more towers. Hundreds of the structures still exist in the Age of Lost Omens, but more than a few were destroyed during or after the Earthfall calamity, so an accurate count is difficult to obtain. Also, on the subject of naming, it's unknown where the name Desgard's Thousand Columns actually comes from. No records exist on who the mysterious Desgard was, or if this name was given to the site during the Thassilonian period or after. My personal suspicion is that Desgard was an early scholar or explorer who named the site after rediscovering it sometime after the Age of Darkness, but I have absolutely no evidence to back up this claim. The Thousand Columns of Desgard, or whatever they were called during the Thassilonian period, weren't the only massive construction project undertaken during the reign of Runelord Xirie, however. Another great work, completed under her watch, was the impressive temple complex called Sechnevali. Sechnevali was, for a time, the grandest temple to the peacock spirit in all of Thassilon, having surpassed the grand temple of the peacock spirit constructed by Xandergul in Cyrusian. Sechnevali was truly a sight to behold. The whole structure hung suspended on impossibly large chains between 4 peaks within the Mindspin Mountains. These chains supported a large metal plate about 18 inches thick, which served as the foundation for the temple itself. The temple complex has, unfortunately, not been described in much detail, but was doubtlessly ornately decorated. I'll dig deeper into temples to the peacock spirit in my video discussing the Sin of Pride. What is known is that this temple had at least 2 layers of rooms: outer rooms which were easily accessible from the temple's exterior, and inner rooms, which seem to have been sacred spaces. Sechnevali was constructed and staffed by the Thrallkeepers Order, an organization of wizard monks dedicated to the peacock spirit, who maintained operations in all the kingdoms of Thassilon. They were supported at Sechnevali, and all throughout the empire, by the Order of the Green Feather, knights who were also devoted to the peacock spirit. Both orders maintained a strong presence in Sechnevali, and in Haruka more broadly, due to the nation's status as the religious heart of Thassilon. Though Sechnevali was appreciated by all of the faithful of the peacock spirit, it drew envy from some. Runelord Xandergul's own pride would not allow him to be outshone, and he soon began construction on the Castle of the Green Feather, a temple complex which would exceed even Sechnevali in scope and grandeur. More on that tomorrow. This increased competitiveness between Xirie and Xandergul might have had some impact on Xirie's ultimate fate, and the actions Xandergul took following her death, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The Thrallkeepers Order and the Order of the Green Feather weren't the only organizations active in Haruka. Many secret societies and cults were practiced within the nation's borders. One order of scholars, though, held a particular loyalty to the Runelords of Sloth. The Thrallkeepers were an order of summoners focused on the binding of singularly powerful outsiders. While all summoners sought powerful entities to call upon, the Thrallkeepers were known for their ambition. They reached into the deepest corners of the abyss and the farthest reaches of the dark tapestry without fear, confident in the perfection of their techniques. While the Thrallkeepers served all the Runelords of Thassilon, in theory, their true loyalty was to the Runelords of Sloth, who were the unquestioned masters of conjuration. Still, the Thrallkeepers were able to set up shop outside of Haruka, in the Fenwell Mountains, and one of their best-known sites was operated within Shalast, with seemingly no interference from the Runelords of Greed. To be entirely honest, I have no idea when the Thrallkeepers were founded. It might very well have been under the reign of Xirie, and I personally think that is likely, given how long she reigned. But they just as easily might have been founded under the rule of some other Runelord. I'm covering them here mostly just for convenience. While relatively little information has been published about the Thrallkeepers, I do have 2 concrete events which can be attributed to them. The first was the binding of Kothval, the mighty Glabrezu demon. Kothval had spent centuries disguised as a vizier all across Galarian, and had tempted numerous mortal souls into corruption and led them to ruin. His machinations were finally discovered by the Thrallkeepers, who worked out a portion of the demon's true name and used it to bind him to a prison known as the Black Edifice. This binding succeeded in trapping Kothval for thousands of years, keeping his evil contained until the Age of Lost Omens. The other known effort of the Thrallkeepers, for which I have found records, was decidedly less successful. Near the Spindlehorn in Shalast, the Order of Summoners maintained a research facility called the Acropolis of the Thrallkeepers. This structure consisted of an imposing tower of black granite, flecked with red crystal, and was set with a 20-foot door so the wizards might unleash their conjured horrors upon the world. At some point during the Thassilonian period, the Thrallkeepers at the Acropolis became extremely confident in their techniques, and, in their hubris, sought to summon something well beyond their capabilities. They reached out into the dark tapestry and contacted a Havaro, a species of alien whose name is derived from the Thassilonian phrase meaning smothering arms. Unfortunately for the Thrallkeepers, their summoning techniques were no match for the Havaro, a fact which shouldn't be surprising to anyone who has seen a Havaro's stat block from 1E. A small portion of the alien manifested in the material plane within the Acropolis, little more than a few tentacles. Even this, though, proved far too strong for the Thrallkeepers, who quickly lost control of their spell. The tentacles of the Havaro slaughtered the summoners to a man, and the alien creature became trapped between the dark tapestry and the material plane. This disaster caused the Order of the Thrallkeepers to abandon the Acropolis altogether, as none were brave enough to enter the lower chambers of the tower to attempt to dismiss the effect which held the strange alien in place. Xirie would go on to rule Haruka for 330 years in total, making her the most successful Runelord of Sloth in terms of sheer length of rule. She might have ruled for even longer, but for the intervention of Nocticula, the Lady in Shadow. Like I mentioned in my video on the Runelords of Wrath, Nocticula struck a bargain with Runelord Angathane, and manipulated him into killing Xirie in -6150 AR. The death of Xirie distracted her patron, the demon lord Colifir, long enough that Nocticula succeeded in assassinating him. Xirie's death kicked off a series of conflicts among the Runelords in -6150, which only ended when Xandergul personally killed 3 Runelords, Angathane, Jura, and Aferend, to de-escalate the situation. Thus, Xirie was succeeded in -6150 AR by Ilthyrius, the second Runelord of Sloth. Little is known about Ilthyrius, though he might have been one of Xirie's apprentices. What is clear is that he inherited a tense political situation in Thassilon, with the possibility of an all-out war having only been narrowly avoided after his predecessor's death. This tense geopolitical environment likely contributed to Ilthyrius's most notable act as Runelord, the creation of the Sword of Sloth. Convinced of his need for a powerful weapon to be borne by his chosen champion, Ilthyrius contacted his conjurers at the Runeforge and issued an order to make for him the grandest of all the Alada High. The wizards of the Runeforge got to work, and in -6120 presented the culmination of their efforts. Unfortunately, the sword was not received well by its master. Ilthyrius looked upon the relatively plain short sword his conjurers presented and found himself disappointed. He thought his conjurers lazy and unwilling to put time and care into their work. On a personal note, I don't really see what his problem was. I really like the visual design of this sword. Aesthetically, it's my favorite of the 7 Swords of Sin, with the possible exception of Garvok. But apparently, Ilthyrius disagreed, as he contacted a company of Zil, a type of 4-armed humanoid native to the ethereal plane, and bade them raid the Runeforge and slaughter the conjurers who presented such a mediocre result. To add insult to injury, Ilthyrius provided the Zils with the sword, and insisted that they use the blade to perform the slaughter. The Zils performed their duty with exactness, butchering the conjurers to a man, and, in so doing, discovered just how powerful the sword truly was. They gave it the name Shintari, a Zil phrase meaning quicksilver talon, then reported back to Runelord Ilthyrius. The Runelord had to admit that he had been wrong, and that the sword was truly impressive. In an act of remembrance, he commanded his new craftsmen at the Runeforge, the replacements for the ones he had executed, to engrave the image of the original craftsman into the blade. How nice of him. From a meta perspective, this story does introduce an interesting question. If the Runeforge was warded against the entry of any direct agents of the Runelords, how did the Zils manage to enter and kill the creators of the Sword of Sloth? I should note, this is not a rhetorical question. I honestly have no idea how they managed this. Mechanically, Shintari is a +5 short sword. When the blade successfully deals damage, it gains the Bane property against the creature type which it had damaged, and this appears to have been able to exceed the normal limitations on a standard Bane property rune. Beyond that, on a successful strike, the foe needed to make a DC 20 Fortitude save or be subjected to the effects of a Dimension Door spell. The wielder of the sword chose the victim's destination. On a critical hit, this effect was increased to the effects of a teleport spell, though the wielder could only choose destination locations with which they were very familiar. Ilthyrius ruled for 145 years before he fell from power in -6105 AR. The details of his rule are, unfortunately, practically unknown, and no information has been provided on how he was eventually deposed. And now, I humbly welcome you to the rapid-fire portion of this video. The next 4 Runelords of Sloth are all blank slates, about whom we know almost nothing at all. Bear in mind that each of these Runelords would have added to the 1,000 columns of Desgard, and likely had multiple dealings with the Thrallkeepers, as well as the churches of Lissala and the Peacock Spirit. None of these potential interactions or events have been detailed in any meaningful way, however, so I won't be speculating or otherwise dwelling on them here. Azaradni succeeded Ilthyrius and ruled as the 3rd Runelord of Sloth for 97 years, until she was overthrown in -6008. Zalalet then followed as the 4th Runelord of Sloth, and ruled for 161 years, until she was overthrown in -5847. Next was Krenlith, who ruled as the 5th Runelord of Sloth for 95 years, until he was overthrown in -5752. Finally, Ivarina took power and ruled as the 6th Runelord of Sloth for an impressive 322 years, until eventually stepping down voluntarily and handing her position over to Krune. To my knowledge, Ivarina is the only Runelord who we know for sure retired and stepped down without dying. Others may have done so, but only Ivarina has ever been confirmed. Ivarina saw a long and comfortable retirement as her well-earned reward for having ruled effectively, and so chose Krune as her successor. She then slipped into indolence, spending her remaining days in a restful, languid bliss. She truly understood sloth like no one before her or since. And that takes us to Krune, the 7th and final Runelord of Sloth. Krune began his career not as a wizard's apprentice, but as a member of the clergy of the Church of Lissala. He started out as a priest in the Great Temple of Lissala in Bakrakhan, Realm of Wrath. There, he divided his focus between the study of runes in their most fundamental form and the study of conjuration magic. Krune excelled in his studies, and, as he grew in power, he also attained positions of increasing prestige. This all culminated in his eventual appointment to the position of High Priest of the Lissalan Church in Haruka, a position which functionally made him the High Priest of Lissala's entire faith. Interestingly, it's unclear if Krune was ever a cleric, or if he was always a wizard. My gut tells me that he must have had at least some training as a cleric early on in his career, due to his eventual position as High Priest. That said, I lack any hard evidence to back up this assertion, and Krune existed late into the Thassilonian period, so late that much of Lissala's priesthood was filled by wizards and other non-divine casters due to the goddess's waning power. I interpret Krune's character arc as that of a priest who eventually abandoned his divine powers in favor of the more concrete arcane abilities promised by a more secular existence, represented mechanically by a cleric retraining their class levels into those of a wizard. Again, though, this is merely my interpretation. Regardless of the mechanics of his character class, Krune was both powerful and wise. He quickly became a top advisor to Runelord Ilthyrius, and expertly ingratiated himself into her good graces. By the time Ilthyrius sought to retire, Krune had positioned himself as the best candidate for her successor, and she personally chose him to ascend to power in her absence. With the ascension of Krune to the position of Runelord of Sloth, the balance of power between the religious factions in Haruka finally solidified. The Church of Lissala became the dominant cultural force, though the faith of the Peacock Spirit would remain powerful until Thassilon's collapse. It appears that Krune maintained his position of High Priest even after he became a Runelord of Sloth, using both political positions to consolidate his personal power. As both a person and a ruler, Krune was well known for his laziness. I know, shocking. His rule was defined in large part by his extreme apathy for the goings-on outside of his realm, and his unwillingness to take direct action against all but the most pressing problems. He typically avoided war and external conflict, instead spending his days in relaxed study. To aid in this, he often leveraged Haruka's stranglehold on both religion and the slave trade to ensure peaceful relations with his neighbors. At the personal level, Krune rarely cast spells on his own, instead surrounding himself with a large and diverse group of servants and viziers, all of whom could cast spells on his behalf to spare him from having to exert himself. All that being said, Krune was more than capable of defending himself and his nation when push came to shove. Though his short stature and languid physique did little to inspire fear in his enemies, his mind was incredibly sharp, and his small piercing eyes hid a wicked cunning. Krune was generally considered the weakest of the 7 Runelords in the dying days of Thassilon, but he was still incredibly powerful, and had more than a few tricks up his sleeve to help deal with his fellow Runelords. As the High Priest of Lissala, Krune had access to the most powerful and complex secrets of his goddess's faith, and rumors claimed that the goddess herself had blessed him with strange eldritch knowledge of the nature of runes themselves, possibly making him the most accomplished scholar of runes since First King Xin himself. Krune manifested and displayed this immense power and knowledge through the employment of runic tattoos, marks of arcane power etched into his skin. Not dissimilar to the runic marks on the rune giants, each of these tattoos served as conduits for arcane magic, allowing Krune to passively channel this power into his body to achieve numerous powerful effects. While nearly all the Runelords employed these runic tattoos to some extent, either on their person or on the bodies of their servants, Krune was the unquestioned master of the technique. Many of the Runelords feared that, should they ever face Krune in combat, he would turn their own runic tattoos against them, meaning he might easily pose a threat to even the most powerful of the Runelords, like Sorshin or Xandergul. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I feel compelled to make a brief digression here to explain the Thassilonian tradition of runic tattoos in more detail. A brief discussion of runic tattoos. Runic tattoos were a common tool employed by the Runelords of Thassilon and their apprentices. I do need to clarify right away, however, that the word tattoo is a bit of a misnomer. These marks were implanted into the skin via magic, which may or may not have been used in conjunction with the application of ink, ritual scarification, or branding, alongside other techniques. I'll be using the phrase tattoos for simplicity, but bear in mind that ink was typically, but not always, used. Many runic tattoos existed during the Thassilonian period, and each distinct style of tattoo functioned as a unique magic item. The effects of these items ranged from providing item bonuses to specific skills to increasing defenses like armor class and saving throws. These tattoos could be implemented fairly easily in 2nd edition, using the existing rules for magical tattoos, in conjunction with the Ink Finder supplement on Pathfinder Infinite. Krune, in particular, employed many such runic tattoos on his body. 3 runes of vitality increased his hit points significantly, while numerous defensive runes scattered over his body substantially increased his armor class. He also employed several runes which allowed him to increase his accuracy with the Dragontooth Spear, though he rarely wielded the weapon in combat. Most impressive of these basic runes, however, were Krune's enhancement runes, each of which acted like an apex magic item and significantly increased Krune's intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. These, alongside his other most powerful defensive runes, required huge amounts of magical energy to sustain, and Krune devised a clever solution. Rather than put all the power of these runes into his body, Krune chose to develop an external runic focus for each of them. These foci took the form of several large metallic plates, covered with a single rune of power. Each focus was bound with a powerful outsider, an extraplanar being whose power would sustain the magic of the effect. This allowed Krune to benefit from multiple powerful defensive effects without having to muster up the power to charge them on his own. All that being said, the effects I've been discussing thus far are ultimately just evolutions of the basic idea of magical tattoos. Of course, Krune and his fellow runelords had access to more than just these basic magical runic tattoos. Unique to the Thassilonian tradition were the Sin runes, the secrets of which the runelords generally kept to themselves. These intricate marks were imbued with raw sin energy, making them exceptionally formidable. A special feat existed in 1e called Inscribe Rune, which allowed a character to create these sin runes, and once created, these runes could only be removed via a miracle, wish, or mage's disjunction effect. Each of the 7 sins of Thassilon had a runic tattoo associated with it. The Rune of Contingency was the sin rune associated with transmutation and greed. It allowed the wielder to benefit from the effects of featherfall and water breathing once per day, and could apply the effects of gaseous form to the bearer if they were reduced to 0 hit points, thus allowing them to maintain consciousness. The Rune of Obedience was the sin rune associated with necromancy and gluttony. It was typically inscribed on a runelord's servants, rather than on the runelord themselves. Upon inscribing this rune, the caster would specify a 10-word course of action, which the bearer would be forbidden from undertaking. If the bearer ever attempted to take this action, they would be inflicted with a -4 penalty to all skill checks and attack rolls. This rune was likely developed to help the runelords of gluttony compensate for their inability to cast enchantment spells. The Rune of Raising was the sin rune associated with evocation and wrath. It could be activated as a free action, and allowed the bearer to ignore all damage resistances and hardness for 5 rounds. Among the known sin runes, this one was one of the most powerful, at least by my assessment. The Rune of Resistance was the sin rune associated with abjuration and envy. Upon the rune's inscription, it granted its bearer resistance 10 to 2 energy types of the caster's choosing. This effect was passive and permanent. The Rune of the Inscrutable One was the sin rune associated with illusion and pride. It provided the bearer the benefits of a permanent misdirection effect, which had the added benefit of allowing the bearer to change who they targeted via the effect at will. This rune also allowed the bearer to learn the name of those trying to scry on them, as well as the nature of the scrying spell being used. The Rune of the Lord's Palanquin was the sin rune associated with Conjuration and Sloth. It allowed the bearer to summon a palanquin to carry them around, replicating the effects of a Magnificent Mount spell. This rune was originally statted as a 15th rank effect, though honestly I have no idea why. It seems like a relatively simple and weak power. Finally, the Rune of the Mistress was the sin rune associated with enchantment and lust. This was the other top contender for strongest of the sin runes, as it allowed the bearer to target a creature once per day and impose a -4 penalty on that creature's next will save against an enchantment effect. This ability did not allow a save, making it incredibly powerful in the hands of a dedicated enchanter like Sortian. As a minor meta note here, I should clarify that these Sin runes were developed under the old 3.5 rules, before Pathfinder even existed as its own unique rule system, so they might need some serious mechanical tweaks before being even close to compatible with the modern 2e mechanics. Krune himself also made use of several additional runic tattoos intended for his servants. These were applied using a special artifact called an inking sphere, which bore enough innate magic to implant runic tattoos upon a user as soon as they uttered a command word. Use of the inking sphere was limited to those who had sworn fealty to Krune himself, and the nation of Haruka more broadly. This artifact created a Sihedron Service brand, a mark which granted the bearer a bonus to attack and damage rolls against conjured creatures. Krune employed other runic tattoos as well, though these were applied more like brands. The Endurance Sihedron brand allowed the bearer to call upon a pool of temporary hit points several times per day, while the Standard Sihedron brand substantially increased the bearer's skill checks related to the recalling of knowledge. In addition to pushing the development of these runes to new heights and employing the most powerful of them on his own body, Krune also had several related abilities which made him the unquestioned master of the art of runic tattoos. His Rune Sight ability functioned as a form of blind sight, allowing him to see any and all runes around him, regardless of whether they were invisible, hidden, or otherwise obscured by non-magical means. If this wasn't enough, he also possessed a unique ability called Runelord's Dominion, which allowed him to designate a target or area and invert the effects of all runes which that target or area held. This would turn all bonuses provided by runic tattoos into penalties, and any special abilities which those tattoos provided would be similarly disrupted. It was this ability, more than any other, which put Krune on the level of many of his fellow runelords. He might have been the weakest of them, but this ability allowed him to punch well above his weight class in contests between the 7 arch-wizards. The other works of Krune. Krune was, like many of his fellow runelords, an accomplished scholar, and while runes and runic tattoos were his preferred area of study, he also created more than a few powerful magic items and even living servants in his time. Krune's rune-carved rod was certainly one of his most powerful creations, and he rarely participated in battle without it. This artifact functioned as a 1e metamagic rod, allowing Krune to apply numerous spell shape effects to his spells simultaneously, multiple times per day. The rod itself appeared as a length of dark gray stone, covered in runes of power, which moved along its surface as though they were alive. I already mentioned the Chalice of Lasala in an earlier video, but other relics of the faith were commonly associated with Krune as well. A good example is Lasala's Caress, a sentient whip crafted from the flayed flesh of some unknown humanoid. Covered in magical runes, the whip would cause immense feelings of guilt in its targets, inflicting the sickened condition. Of course, Krune wouldn't be the Runelord of Sloth if he didn't develop at least a few spells or items intended to make his life easier. The swipe spell is one such example, as it allowed the caster to simply point at an item in someone else's possession and attempt to summon it to their own hand. The Ring of the Clean Hands was another example, as it allowed the wielder to employ the telekinesis spell several times per day to achieve numerous effects, including combat maneuvers. The effigy of the favored servant was probably the most powerful item in this vein. It functioned as a figurine of wondrous power, transforming on command into a mindless hill giant servant. The figurine could even serve as a repository for dying souls, and the bearer could trap the soul of a dying servant within to ensure that the hill giant servant would retain that soul's consciousness. Krune also tried his hands at the creation of new living creatures, much like his fellow runelords. He is commonly credited with the creation of the gelatinous cube, which he supposedly forged within the ooze pits of Zin Haruka. This location has been lost to time, but it seems reasonable to assume that other ooze-based experimentation occurred here as well, led by Krune and his most learned apprentices. Krune is also co-credited with the creation of the Bola, a snake-like monster which was originally theorized by Ivarina. Bolas take the form of immense serpents covered in reddish-brown fur. Originally bred from the monstrous serpents of the Mindspin Mountains, Krune infused the Bolas with extraplanar energies from both fiendish and elemental sources. They possessed a voracious hunger, and had a tendency to gorge themselves upon whatever targets were nearby, making them exceptionally dangerous to even their own handlers. To counteract this danger, Krune also inflicted the beasts with an irresistible periodic lethargy. As soon as the Bolas finished eating, they would promptly fall asleep, at which point Krune's agents could collect them and return the beasts to their cages. Krune regularly deployed these serpents behind enemy lines, trusting their endless hunger to drive them to reliably sow chaos. Krune's plan to survive Earthfall. As the Earthfall meteor drew near Golarion, Krune, through some unknown means, became aware of the imminent danger. Without access to a major rune well, likely because the creation of such an artifact would have required too much effort on his part, Krune was forced to devise another method of survival. Krune chose to fall back onto his faith, and surmised that the most survivable structure in Thassilon likely wasn't a physical structure, but a religious one. He decided to rely upon the Church of Lysala to be his agents in the world after Earthfall. It would be their responsibility to wake him from whatever method of suspended animation he devised for himself, and his status as the Church's high priest practically guaranteed their loyalty. In addition to using the Church of Lysala to wake him from his slumber, Krune also left orders for them to re-establish Haruka in his name, as the thought of having to do all that work on his own was antithetical to Krune's worldview. So long as even small fragments of the Church of Lysala survived in an organized capacity, Krune would have agents willing to ensure his return. Those of you who watched my Lysala video earlier in this series might be noticing a fatal flaw in this plan, but we'll get there. As for the mechanics of Krune's plan, these were fairly straightforward. He developed a version of the Soul Trap spell, which would be able to store his soul in stasis for hundreds of years. His body, meanwhile, could be preserved in a secure location via a gentle repose effect. Failing that, his body could simply be healed if it were somehow destroyed. This method of survival was markedly simpler than those devised by many of the other Runelords, but had a few downsides. For example, if the gemstone containing Krune's soul were destroyed, he would be killed, or in the best-case scenario, raised from stasis too early. Additionally, this plan was extremely reliant on outside help, far more so than the plans of Krune's fellows who chose to employ rune wells. To mitigate the relative vulnerability of the gemstone which would serve as his home, Krune chose to construct a fortification, one so secure and secret that its defenses might never be penetrated. Krune chose to hide this fortress in plain sight, within the canyon which housed the 1,000 columns of Desgard. This canyon, with its hordes of preserved extraplanar servants and unpredictable magical hazards, made for an excellent defense. The structure which Krune eventually built was named the 1,000th Spire, for it was the last and most formidable of the towers constructed at the site. The 1,000th Spire would serve as another repository for Krune's armies of conjured servants, but would also allow access to Krune's final resting place. This resting place was called the Rune Vault, and it consisted of a demiplane hidden deep underground, made up of several chambers. It contained both the gemstone which preserved Krune's soul, as well as the sarcophagus which contained his body. Additionally, the sanctum stored the runic focus for each of the mightiest defensive runic tattoos on Krune's body. These were the metal plates which I described earlier, the ones bound to conjured outsiders, which served as the external foci and power sources for Krune's most powerful magic tattoos. The presence of these foci, alongside Krune's soul and body, made the Rune Vault a tremendously important but also vulnerable place, ensuring that even the impossibly lazy Krune took great care in ensuring the site's security. To guide the followers of Lysala to his body so they might reawaken him, Krune developed a collection of lesser magical items called refuge tokens. These could lead a bearer to the 1000th spire through the use of a command word, allowing them to locate the place of Krune's preservation, though it would be up to them to bypass the tower's defenses, enter the rune vault, and awaken Krune himself. To ensure that the way was adequately prepared for his return, a condition which in this context means to ensure that Krune himself would need to do as little work as possible upon his return to re-establish his kingdom, Krune also saw fit to scatter these refuge tokens and the plates containing their command words all across his kingdom and broader Thassilon. Krune's intention with this action was simple. His servants should either be numerous enough, powerful enough, or clever enough to collect the refuge tokens and their command words before being able to bring Krune himself back into the world. And so it was that, on the eve of Earthfall, Krune entered his rune vault and placed himself into stasis, surrounded by his most powerful conjured servants. His followers hunkered down in their fortresses, ready to wait out the coming storm. The faithful of Lissala offered prayers to a goddess who was already beginning to abandon them. And somewhere off in the distance of the Mindspin Mountains, a flight of powerful silver dragons watched and waited for their opportunity to strike. More on them at the end of this series. For players looking to build characters devoted to the Sin of Sloth, the Virtue of Zeal, or the School of Conjuration more broadly, here are some ideas. Common personal edicts among practitioners of Sloth might include to never expend energy unless it is necessary, or to manipulate others into doing your bidding. Conversely, common personal edicts among practitioners of Zeal might include to enthusiastically work hard to achieve your goals, to recognize your limits but seek to expand them, or to accept help from others but only while also contributing to work yourself. For those using the alignment rules, obviously the Sin of Sloth tends toward evil, while the Virtue of Zeal tends toward good. For characters who favor weapons in combat, both the spear and short sword are solid picks for those wanting to feel some connection to Sloth or Zeal, since these weapons are the weapon types of the Alara Keen and Alara High of Conjuration, respectively. For other weapons, the Called Property rune allows a weapon to be teleported back to a user's hand, and is a conjuration effect. If your GM is alright with it, you could also reflavor the Returning Property rune to function as a teleportation effect. Treasure Vault also debuted the new Impossible Property rune, allowing the wielder of a weapon to attack from enormous range and ignore huge amounts of cover by employing conjuration magic. In terms of clothing and gear, conjurers in the time of Thassilon typically favored the color blue, though Krune himself has never been depicted in the color. Crimson and gold have also been associated with conjuration, outside of traditional Thassilonian beliefs. Due to Krune's close association with Lissala and her faith, green, gold, and brown might all have been commonly worn by conjurers in ancient Haruka as well, though the colors of the faith of the peacock spirit might have been just as common at various points throughout the nation's history. Practitioners of Zeal would likely choose clothing well suited to study or hard work, while practitioners of Sloth would likely choose clothing intended for lounging or other forms of leisure. Magic items like the Thrower's Bandolier, the Lucky Draw Bandolier, or sets of paired pockets might be another way for characters to incorporate conjuration effects into their clothing or equipment. From a religious perspective, deities with a connection to Sloth are a bit rare. Jubilex is the patron demon lord of Sloth, and also has an interest in creatures of the ooze subtype. Jubilex has not yet been ported over to 2E, and might no longer be canon as of the remaster. Zeal is a bit more common as a theme among Pathfinder deities, and Irori, Falena, or Balumdar might all be great options. Deities of travel might appeal to conjurers who either call entities from beyond the material plane, or who use teleportation to explore distant locales. These might include Desna, Heifeng, Kofusachi, Ing, or Count Renalk, among others. Of course, both the Peacock Spirit and Lasala have strong connections to the nation of Haruka, but I would suggest talking to your GM if these deities appeal to you, since world events surrounding them might make it difficult to incorporate them into certain stories. Mechanically, several classes might be easily tied thematically to Conjuration, or the history of Haruka in Thassilon. The most obvious of these is a wizard, especially one focusing on the art of summoning within the School of the Boundary. Beyond that, though, I think the Summoner is an even better fit as a representation of Conjuration. The entire gimmick of that class is based around the conjuring of a powerful and unique creature, often from beyond the material plane. Odd as it might be to say, this bounded caster probably has a stronger connection to conjuration magic than most full spellcasters in PF2E, and if I were to choose any non-wizard class to serve as a Runelord of Conjuration, a summoner with a charisma-based spellcaster archetype tacked on would be my first choice. Similarly, though to a lesser extent, the Laughing Shadow Magus does a great job of connecting to the teleportation subschool of Conjuration, albeit with a more martial feel. In terms of full casters, players also have a few really solid options. Witches make for some of the best summoning characters in the game, with their unrivaled mastery of sustaining multiple spells at the same time. Similar to the Magus, Unbound Step Psychics make excellent use of teleportation magic. On a less mechanical and more thematic level, many conjurers have summoned extraplanar beings on the material plane over the course of Galarian's history, and these beings have procreated with the humanoids of Galarian on innumerable occasions. Sorcerers, with a bloodline tracing back to a conjured servant of a powerful Thassilonian archwizard, might feel a connection to Conjuration, even if they themselves do not favor that type of magic. For characters with familiars, spiders have historically been seen as having some connection to Conjuration, likely for their ability to seemingly produce webs out of thin air. I should also call out the newly announced Runesmith class as a good option for players to connect with the runic specialization of Runelord Krune specifically. Krune's mastery over runes was the stuff of legend, so a scholar of ancient Thassilon who was hoping to emulate this mastery might become a runesmith as a mechanical representation of this knowledge. Just like with classes, a few ancestries stand out as good options for characters associated with Conjuration. Humans were the most prominent ancestry in ancient Haruka, and these hailed primarily from the Aslanti, Varisian, and Shoanti ethnicities. As a more outside-the-box pick, players might find it interesting to play a Kolo, one whose ancient ancestors once served as slavers or soldiers for the Runelords of Haruka, but who fled Thassilon during or after Earthfall. Such a character might be returning to Varisia to explore the lost history of their people. Any of the planar heritages might be a great choice for a character connected to Conjuration magic, for a reason similar to the reason I suggested sorcerers as a great class option just a minute ago. Before I close out this section, there are a few more cultural touchstones on Galarian worth mentioning. Within Varisian hero tradition, the cards the Midwife and the Peacock were taken as representatives of Conjuration. Similarly, among astrologers, Brethida, the largest planet within Galarian's star system, is seen as the representative of Conjuration. For GMs looking to incorporate the School of Conjuration, the Runelords of Sloth, or the nation of Haruka into a campaign, here are a few more ideas. I know I've mentioned them several times throughout this video, but the 1,000 Columns of Desgard really are a fantastic location for GMs to use in an adventure or campaign. The site has everything: natural and manufactured magical hazards, multiple potential dungeons, multiple millennia of rich arcane history, and a location isolated enough from the rest of the world that your players can easily feel a responsibility to solve whatever problems they find on their own, rather than going for help. My immediate idea with this location is to put the players in opposition to an evil cult, attempting to unleash the armies of a particular Runelord of Sloth, perhaps one of the 3 or 4 about whom we know very little. This cult could spend a lot of time identifying which towers contain that Runelord's servants, then devising a method for freeing those servants from stasis and taking control of them. This would give the PCs plenty of opportunities to interact with and oppose the cult. Once the cultists get to the point where their plans are on the brink of success, the PCs could then come to a terrifying but intriguing realization. The most effective way to destroy the cult's army of conjured minions is to unleash an army of conjured minions of their own. If the PCs managed to learn enough from the cult, they could perform the same rituals to unleash the forces of the other Runelords of Sloth, resulting in legion upon legion of unleashed conjured horrors smashing against one another until all the armies within the 1,000 columns have been completely destroyed. On a slightly smaller scale, the School of Conjuration allows for the creation of some seriously intriguing bosses, or NPCs, assuming you are willing to play a little fast and loose with mechanics in exchange for some narrative fun. The art of summoning extraplanar creatures in PF2E is fairly limited for players. Summoning spells are typically considered fairly weak, and are intentionally set up to ensure that summoning a small army of meat shields is not really a viable strategy to survive. That said, the Pathfinder narrative is filled with examples of characters summoning creatures well above their level of power to accomplish great and terrible deeds. It might be fun to create a villain who is a summoner, who accidentally tried a summoning well beyond their capabilities, and who is paying the price during your adventure. A junior summoner might find themselves enthralled to their summoned creature, allowing your PCs to discover that the wizard they've been thinking is the big bad is actually just a pawn of the devil which they've conjured. This devil might be exceptionally strong, but now has the weakness of needing to defend the relatively squishy wizard who summoned them, for fear of being dismissed upon the wizard's death. Another interesting character might come from a summoner who managed to summon something well beyond their own strength, but who has also managed to retain control of the creature in question. I really like the idea of some mid-level wizard who succeeded through sheer luck in binding some incomprehensible horror from the depths of the outer rifts, but who now needs to maintain perfect control at all times, for fear of what that thing will do to them if their grip ever loosens. This type of character could very easily experience an eventual psychological break, giving you as the GM a great opportunity to take your acting over the top and draw inspiration from characters like Kira or Homelander. Finally, a few ancient sites in Haruka remain as points of interest in the Age of Lost Omens. Sechnevali presents an interesting dungeon for players and GMs to explore. The Hanging Temple still exists in the Age of Lost Omens, though it is now occupied by the undead remains of its former inhabitants. These include powerful undead spellcasters from the Thoracic Order, as well as Grave Knights from the Order of the Green Feather. The temple has been only partially explored in recent years, and the scholars who have been sent from the major cities of Varisia have recently stopped contacting their patrons outside the temple complex. The temple itself is still remarkably well preserved, and 3 of the 4 massive chains supporting the complex are still in working condition. Not far away, the obelisk forest of Mundate remains relatively unexplored. The stone pillars of this forest, which number in the thousands, stand about 10 feet high. Explorers have claimed that the pillars are hollow, based on how they sound, though vanishingly few reports exist proving this fact. The one report which does exist claims that explorers from Korvosa once cracked open one of the stone pillars and found a dehydrated corpse within. The authors of this report were attacked soon after by an unidentified undead horror, and the next morning found the pillar they had opened had been restored. And that marks the end of Day 9 of the 12 Days of Sinmas, and my examination of the Sin of Sloth. This was another one of my scripts which I wrote on a work trip to Italy, so if you're listening to this, just imagine me using the Italian hand gesture next to the mic while I record my audio. Relatively little has been published on the Runelords of Sloth, but I really hope we get a good look at Zin Haruka in the future. I think the ruins of that city, especially with the remains of the portal network, have a lot of potential as a dungeon. Up next, my examination of the Runelords continues, with my deep dive into the Sin of Envy and the Runelords of Edasseril, a nation which I have accidentally written as Erastil many times during the writing of this series. Here's hoping none of those typos make it into these recordings. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.